What's up guys, Agent here with the first of a few PTS videos that I will be releasing for this 6.1.0 and onward. I won't be releasing as many videos. For more information, you can go ahead and check out the patch notes video that are released, I believe at this point 2 days ago. Basically, I don't really have the pattern for the game anymore, but I will be trying to answer a couple of more of the hot button topics that people have been discussing in the PTS patch notes. One of those being the new and improved Alkosh. So I'm on the PTS right now, and here is the new Alkosh. So you can see here that when you activate a synergy, you send out a shockwave that deals a certain amount of physical damage, plus an additional amount of dot damage, essentially. And it reduces the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by the amount of the initial hit's damage done for the duration being the 10 seconds. Now, on live, this is a flat amount. So the amount of resistance that you remove is actually 3010 on the live server. It's a fixed amount, and it'll always be that amount no matter how much your damage changes on the Alkosh damage. So with this, you can see here that I'm already sitting above that 3010 fixed value that we currently have on the Greymoor patch. So this is a buff to Alkosh. Now, one of the things that I've seen floated around is people think that this is their way, ZOS's way, of making Alkosh a DPS-oriented set compared to a tank-oriented set because standard DPS have higher offensive stats. While that is true, it is not necessarily the case that Alkosh is going to be good on a standard DPS. The reason for that is the proc damage of pretty much all proc sets in the game are a fixed value that are only modified by percentage modifiers as well as penetration value. So for example, right now my weapon damage is sitting at 2430 and the Alkosh proc is going to deal 4214 physical damage. If we were to bump up our weapon damage here, so for example if I were to change this out for a weapon damage enchant, you can see our weapon damage went up to 2638, but the proc damage remained the same at 4214. Now you might say, well, what about crits? You might remember, and I do forgive some of the newer players here, but proc sets cannot crit. This was changed, I believe, very, very long time ago. I think this was pre-1 Tamriel even, where they made it so proc sets couldn't crit. They were a big issue in PvP, so they decided just to remove the crit chance off of all proc damage. So that 4214 that you see right there cannot be affected by weapon damage, it cannot be affected by max stamina, and it can also not crit either. Standard DPS do have higher damage stats, that is not incorrect. Do have higher weapon damage and higher max stamina usually than tanks, but those stats don't matter for Alkosh because it is proc damage. Again, the only thing that affects it are percentage modifiers like champion points and things like minor berserk, minor vulnerability. Give you guys a demonstration here. We have 100 points into mighty, and if I were to take these points out entirely, from the distribution and take a look at our Alkosh proc, you can see here that our Alkosh proc went down to 3762. So, what does that mean though? Don't stamina DPS have better CP modifiers? Arguably yes, for DPS in general. Again, we're only taking a look at the initial hit of Alkosh, which counts as direct damage. Remember that stamina DPS also need to invest in things like Precise Strikes and Thaumaturge, as well as piercing. So right now we have 100 into Mighty and 100 into Master at Arms. This basically maximizes the amount of debuff that we can get from Alkosh. If you were to have this setup here as a stamina DPS, you would be losing out on a fair amount of damage because you will have 0 points in the Thaumaturge or very few points in the Thaumaturge and Precise Strikes compared to your standard stamina DPS setup. Now, for a lot of standard DPS, you'll typically be running something closer to about 64 points into Mighty and anywhere between like 52 to 48 points into Master at Arms. So it's actually not that big of a loss. We're talking about 6% from Master at Arms and 2% from Mighty for a total of 8% difference here, which is not that big of a deal, especially when you consider that Major Slayer is typically speaking going to be more on a DPS rather than a tank. So obviously Major Slayer will make up that difference there because Major Slayer adds 15% rather than 8% that you're losing here. So there is still that argument that stamina DPS might still be in a better position to make use of Alkosh. However, just because Major Slayer is more likely to make its way onto a stamina DPS doesn't mean that tanks cannot get Major Slayer either. So that argument, while it does have some merit, is not necessarily going to really change anything here. Now, one of the things that tanks are able to do now is basically build themselves forward to maximize that Alkosh proc. So maximize all your points into penetration, for example, run sharpened on your weapon, run lover with all divines, for example, or a few points in divines to maximize your penetration. And obviously, they have the ability to put 100 points into mastered arms and mighty in order to maximize the damage that way. So in terms of how much we're able to hit on a tank, first, let's get into combat with the trial dummy so we get things like minor berserk and minor vulnerability on. Go ahead and hit blessed shards, and now we basically wait. So essential housing tools, I believe, is currently broken. Some of its functionality is broken, so I don't have it active, so we do have to wait naturally for us to get out of combat here. So once we get out of combat, we'll be able to see just how much we're able to hit with that Alkosh initial hit. All right, so we're out of combat. You can see here that our Roar of Alkosh hit for 5,042. So this is a buff compared to the 3,010. So we're getting an additional 2,000 physical penetration and spell penetration from Alkosh. What this means is that now things like Torg's Infused Pressure are going to be a little bit less needed. Potentially stamina DPS, you might not need to run Sharpened, and magic DPS, you might not even need to run any points in the piercing at all. Now, this is obviously not as high as we can possibly get it. Like I mentioned earlier, we could also get things like Major Slayer and Major Vulnerability on the dummy. Plus, we also have things like Martial Knowledge and Zens, which the dummy does not have applied to it. So, I am on a Necromancer because we need to be on a Necromancer in order to get that Major Vulnerability. Plus, I am also wearing War Machine as well for the Major Slayer. Let's see just how high we can hit with our Alkosh proc if we have both Major Slayer and Major Vulnerability active at the same time. Go ahead and hit our dummy with Pestilent Colossus. We have our Major Slayer and we use our Alkosh proc. Let's see just how high we're able to push it here without Martial Knowledge or Zens. So with Martial Knowledge, we're getting additional 5% damage taken, and with Zens, we're getting up to a maximum of additional 5% damage taken. Obviously, that's not going to translate into direct 10% increase because of the way it all interacts with each other, but we will see a pretty sizable increase nonetheless. You can see here that with Major Slayer and with Major Vulnerability active, if we time our Alkosh proc correctly, we can get up to a 7,000 armor shred with that initial hit. That is huge. This is basically doubling the strength of Alkosh. Now, of course, this is more or less a unlikely scenario to happen here. You basically have to wait for that Major Vulnerability. You'd have to wait for Major Slayer from the new and improved Master Architect or War Machine to hit you as a tank. So more generally, you're probably going to see numbers closer to that 5k, possibly 5.4, 5.5k if you have Martial Knowledge Zens in group here. But this is still a huge buff to Alkosh, and this really more or less reinforces Alkosh as a tank set. Doesn't really make that difference to, doesn't make that transition over to a stamina DPS set. Now, if they wanted to make Alkosh a stamina DPS set, what I would recommend is actually having the proc damage scale off of weapon damage. Basically, what you could do is instead of having it deal a flat amount of damage and saying that it reduces physical and spell resistance by that damage, make that initial hit scale off of weapon damage. You can say basically it deals, let's say, 200 physical damage for every 100 weapon damage, or 100 physical damage for every 100, basically 1-to-1 ratio of your weapon damage. That would then start to favor stamina DPS because obviously as a tank, you're not really going to be running very high weapon damage. You might be able to break 3k if you really build for it, but because of the sets that you're wearing, you're not going to have very high weapon damage. So if they make it so that the initial hit does scale off of weapon damage, then in that instance, yes, Alkosh would be able to transition over to stamina DPS set because stamina DPS, typically speaking, will be running very high weapon damage, up to 5 to possibly even 6k weapon damage at a time. So if they do make it scale 1-to-1, then and only then would you see Alkosh being put on stamina DPS rather than tanks. But even then, that's a hard argument to make here because you also have to consider the DPS loss from running Alkosh compared to running some other set like Laquestes or Reliquin or the new and improved Yandir's Might. Well, that pretty much concludes this video. Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think about the changes to Alkosh and whether you think the changes that I recommended would make sense if they wanted to make Alkosh a stamina DPS oriented set. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.